Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Erica Feller, and I have spent many years with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, including as the Assistant High Commissioner for Refugees. I'm currently here as a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at Melbourne University in the School of Government, and my very pleasurable task is to welcome you here this evening to hear what I'm sure will be a very provocative, a very thought-provoking and a fascinating presentation by our guest speaker, Mr. Julian Burnside, who I will shortly introduce you to. But before I do so, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Also, by way of opening comment, I think some words about tonight's occasion are in order. It will be the 7th such oration since the inception of the Hamer series of orations in 2007. It has been made possible through the generosity of the Hamer family, whose sponsorship of it is recognition of the major contribution to the political culture of our country by David Hamer, member of the House of Representatives for Isaacs for 8 years and a Victorian senator for another 12 years. Amongst many other things, he was known for his very strong commitment to the Westminster reforms. It's fitting that the Melbourne School of Government is a chief partner for this event. The school is an interdisciplinary endeavour serving to provide a platform for informed and independent debate on contemporary issues going to the heart of good governance in Australia and its future as a responsible and collegial partner in the region and beyond. Clearly, the management of refugee and asylum challenges confronting Australia, the nations of Southeast Asia, and the countries of the world falls very much into the category of such issues. The world is witnessing the highest levels of global displacement since the Second World War, with some 60 million people currently affected, either as internally displaced persons inside their country or as refugees outside their country. Not a day has passed over recent months when there hasn't been a devastating article about refugees and migrants flowing into Western Europe. But if the focus has been very much on Europe, this should not be understood to mean that the situation is any less dire in other parts of the world. An estimated 63,000 people took to the boats in 2014, mainly from Myanmar and Bangladesh, to Thailand, Malaysia, and beyond. 25,000 people used this sea route in the first quarter of 2015. The level and scale of brutality and abuse that's been accompanying these boat people, these boat movements, has been unprecedented, including in this region. There's a potential issue developing in this part of the world, I feel, with the situation in Europe eclipsing has the danger to eclipse problems elsewhere, deflecting consideration away from the continuing concerning situation in the Andaman Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and of course Papua New Guinea and Nauru. This gives added significance and timeliness to the presentation tonight by Julian Burnside. Julian probably needs very little introduction to the very large majority of you here tonight. An eminent Melbourne barrister and Queen's Counsel, he is particularly well known for and appreciated for his courageous, outspoken, and no-holds-barred advocacy on behalf of refugees and asylum seekers in this country. He has written extensively about the plight of those caught up in the detention system, and he has effectively litigated claims on their behalf. His passions, though, are many, and he is also closely involved in the world of art and music. In 2004, he was elected a living national treasure. In 2009, he was made an officer of the Order of Australia, and in 2014, he was awarded the Sydney Peace Prize. I'm sure you'll agree with me that we have a very fascinating speaker, and we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say. He'll speak to us for about 45 minutes, leaving around 15 minutes or so for audience questions. Please now join me in welcoming Julian to the podium.
I'll try to take it for 45 minutes. Thank you very much, Erica, and thank you all for coming. I live in dread of being asked to go along and speak and no one turns up. It's a great honour to be invited to give the Hamer Oration, which I understand is dedicated not only to David Hamer but also to Dick Hamer. I never met David Hamer. I had a fair bit to do with Dick Hamer because we were on the board of Musica Viva together. And as Erica has said, David Hamer was a member of the House of Reps for Isaacs for a number of years and then a senator for Victoria. And he wrote famously a book called Can Responsible Government Survive in Australia, which could hardly be more appropriate for what I want to talk about tonight. And Dick Hamer, probably the best thing to be, the most significant thing about Dick Hamer is he was one of the greatest premiers we've ever had in this state. And his legacy will live a long time. Both of them, David and Dick Hamer, were both Liberals when that word meant something, when it meant something very different from the way it's used these days. I think the best observation about where Liberal politics, or politics generally, have gone in Australia was, I think in 2003 or 4, I was on the same platform with Malcolm Fraser, who I had quite a lot to do with in the last 15 years, with no surprise. I had spoken first, and I finished my remarks with the wish that the next Labor Prime Minister of Australia would be Malcolm Fraser, which of course got a laugh then as it did today. And Malcolm then got up and he thanked me for my compliment and said, of course it'll never happen, I'm much too far to the left for them. Which I think in a single sentence captures precisely what has gone wrong in this country over the last, I guess, 15 years, maybe a little longer. I would say that Tampa was the time when our values began to collapse. Now, I may be wrong about that because I was never interested in politics, and it just happened by chance that Tampa was the occasion that got me involved in politics, kicking and screaming against my will. By the way, the speech I'm going to give tonight is mostly the speech that I had planned to give. If you want to see what I was planning to say, you'll be able to read it in the conversation tomorrow. But I've received a couple of bits of information this afternoon, which means I'm departing from my own text, and I'm allowed to do that, I think. But Tampa was the occasion which got me involved in the political debate. Until then, I'd never paid attention to politics. I couldn't bear it. My real interest was in the arts, and it was through that connection that I knew Dick Hamer. But in 2001, you'll recall the Tampa episode happened. He was a boat which, at our request, a Norwegian cargo ship which, at our request, had gone to the aid of a small refugee boat which had begun to break up in the Indian Ocean. And the captain of the Tampa later said that he thought that that boat might have held maybe 40 or 50 people, and he was astonished when he counted 438 Afghan Hazara refugees onto the Tampa from the Palapa, which was breaking up in the Indian Ocean. The captain of the Tampa was confronted with a problem because it was licensed to carry 50 people. It had 47 crew, and all of a sudden 438 unintended passengers. Some of them were in a pretty weakened state of health, and so the captain of the Tampa told the Australian government, at whose request he had saved them, he said that he was going to put them ashore at Christmas Island, which was fairly close. The Howard government denied him permission to land at Christmas Island, but he defied the Australian government in the best traditions of the sea, sailed into Australian waters off Christmas Island and into Australian history. The SAS then took command of the bridge at gunpoint and then began the standoff as they couldn't go forward because the SAS were in the bridge with guns, and he couldn't go elsewhere because he wasn't licensed to go elsewhere with so many people on board. And then John Moneta, who I'm very glad to see over here, thought up the idea of a case theory that might resolve the impasse. Like many people, all I could see was the long telephoto lens photographs of these poor people huddled together on the deck of a steel ship in the tropical sun. That struck me as a bad way to treat people. I didn't know about refugee policy or anything like that. Anyway, John thought up this very good case theory, and we went to court, and the case began on a Friday night. At the government's request, the case continued Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then Justice North adjourned to consider his decision and handed down his decision at 2:15 in the afternoon, Melbourne time, on the 11th of September 2001. The significance of that has been reverberating through this community ever since. 9 hours later or thereabouts, the attack on America happened, and the next morning you no longer had terrorists, you only had Muslim terrorists. You no longer had boat people, you only had Muslim boat people. And it was then that the Howard government started calling boat people illegals. It was interesting, and John will remember this, that during the running of the case in front of Justice North, there was never any suggestion that any of the people rescued by Tampa might be a risk to Australia. But during the appeal, which happened a few days after the 11th of September, during the appeal, the Solicitor General for the Commonwealth floated the idea in passing that some of them might have been terrorists. There wasn't a shred of evidence to support it, but that was the temper of the times. As we now know, Howard's stand in relation to Tampa was purely political. It was done because he wanted to haul back from the clutches of One Nation some Liberal supporters who had drifted across towards the right. And it began an inexorable move of both major parties to the right side of politics. When I say the right side, I don't mean the correct side, I mean that side. The Tampa episode and its cynical political purposes began a process of deceiving the public. So that, and the Liberals, to be candid, the Liberals have been ferocious on this. You know, we've had the constant repetition of illegals, so that I think many people in the community now think that boat people are criminals. And then, of course, under the Abbott government, we were exposed to the notion of border protection. And Scott Morrison, let me say, now he's nice and furry and cuddly after being Social Services Minister, Scott Morrison is a dishonest hypocrite for everything he said about border protection and illegals. He talks about boat people as if we need to be protected from them, and as if mistreating people to protect us from dangerous criminals is a sensible idea. And of course, if they are dangerous criminals, protecting us from them would be a good idea. Maybe the technique could be adjusted, but it's broadly sensible to protect a community against dangerous criminals. Of course, when you realise that they're frightened, innocent human beings seeking protection from terrorists, then it looks very different. But unfortunately, the so-called Liberal rhetoric on this has carried the day, and to their eternal discredit, the Labor Party have never used their position to contradict the deceptions of the Liberal government. The Pacific solution, of course, was cobbled together during the running of the Tampa litigation. And the Pacific solution, it's bizarre, looking back. If only we could have the Pacific solution as it was then, I'd be less troubled than having what we have now. It's bizarre to think that when we had Abbott and Morrison as Prime Minister and Immigration Minister, I began to wish we could have Howard and Ruddock back. an almost unthinkable idea. But there are many dreadful stories about what happened in the Pacific Solution first time round, but let one story stand for all of them. Kate and I had become heavily involved in the issue for obvious reasons, and on the 26th of August 2002, a number of the people who'd been rescued by Tampa and had been taken to Nauru were planning to hold a small commemorative occasion to mark 1 year since they had been rescued from the ocean by the Tampa. On the morning of the 26th of August 2002, a young man called Mohammed Sawar in Nauru woke up in his bed in the detention centre in Nauru, uttered a couple of cries and fell back dead. No one knows why he died. We got a letter from some of his friends. They wrote, "We regret to inform you that in the early morning of 26th August, Mohammed Sawar, ID number 391, an Afghan Tampa asylum seeker, died. He was quite young and seemed to be in his mid-20s. Actually, we have a photograph of him. He looks as though he's 16. He was a Hazara from central Afghanistan. He was one of the 438 asylum seekers who were rescued from the ocean by the Norwegian freighter MV Tampa. He spent almost 1 year on board the Tampa and Manura and in detention on Nauru. He was hospitalised in Nauru for the first few weeks. He was refused refugee status. Just a few days before his death, he was interviewed on his appeal to the negative decision he had received on his claim for protection. His close associates who had seen him coming out of the interview room had seen he was very concerned and unhappy for the ways he was asked questions." I should interrupt the reading to say Mohammed Sawar was a Hazara from Afghanistan, which means about 99.9% certain that he was a genuine refugee. But on Nauru, back then, they were using Pashtun interpreters for Hazara refugee claimants, and the Pashtun are the sworn enemy of the Hazara. In recent weeks, he was seen to be stressed, worried, depressed, and almost isolated, but Mohammed Sawar was proved to be a voiceless and quiet and would speak very little of his concerns and pains he might be suffering. Recently, he was seen sitting alone and thinking very deeply. Eventually, he has sought the asylum only God can grant. Nauru and Australia both refused to conduct an autopsy on Mohammed Sawar, which is why none of us know to this day how he died or why. By August 2002, as you'll recall, the Taliban had been removed from power in Afghanistan, and Australia was relentlessly sending Afghan Hazara refugees back to Afghanistan against all of their protests. Although they were sending back living Hazara refugee applicants to Afghanistan, they refused to send Mohammed Sawar's corpse back because they said it was too dangerous to send a corpse back to Afghanistan. You may remember that in the wake of September 11, this actually brings me fairly close to my topic, in the wake of September 11, we were all sent little rescue packages by the Howard government. You'll recall they had fridge magnets in them to protect us from terrorists. They included a letter from the then Prime Minister, which included these words: "Dear fellow Australian, I'm writing to you because I believe you and your family should know more about some key issues affecting the security of our country and how we can all play a part in protecting our way of life. As a people, we have traditionally engaged the world optimistically. Our open, friendly nature makes us welcome guests and warm hosts." And he went on more and more in the same vein. Don Watson, whose writing I greatly enjoy, wrote about this in his book Death Sentence. And he said of this, "This rose-coloured boasting smells of some nightmare Ministry of Information. The phrase, 'as a people,' might not be a lie, but it smells like one, and it sits askew to the element of conservative political philosophy that opposes all attempts to categorise people by class or historic tendency or any other conceit that will serve as an excuse for eliminating them. The people of Australia is not so rank because it doesn't carry the suggestion that some mythic or historic force unites us in our destiny. But if we must have as a people, then traditionally has to go. And not only because optimistically is sitting on top of it, it has to go because it is so at odds with Australian history it could fairly be called a lie. Traditionally, we built barriers against the world we're alleged to have engaged so optimistically. Traditionally, we clung to the mother country for protection against that same world. Traditionally, we took less of an optimistic view of the world than an ironic, fatalistic view of the world. The smugness of the sentence about our being lovely guests and warm hosts is so larded with fantasy and self-delusion, it transcends neighbours and becomes Edna Everage. It will occur to some readers, surely, that it has been our nature recently to play very cold hosts to uninvited guests, the sort of people we don't want here, who throw their children into the sea, who are not fun-loving, welcoming, warm, sunny, etc. Given our recent history, we might wonder if the words are as ingenuous as they sound. The thought, even the subconscious thought, might have been of a piece with Medea's soft talk. Thus, as a people, Australians are very nice. People who don't agree with this proposition are not nice people. People who are not nice are not Australian, in the sense of Australians as a people. People who are not prepared to be Australian as a people should shut up or piss off back where they came from. Now, it does occur to me that Don Watson characteristically nailed it right there. The idea of sending fridge magnets to protect us. Maybe they were protecting us from boat people, who knows? I want to tell you a couple of other brief stories about our treatment of asylum seekers onshore as well as offshore. One man, and these are all stories I know directly from the people involved, one man was from Iraq. He'd arrived in Australia having fled Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. He'd been an enemy of that government. He'd been held as a political prisoner in Abu Ghraib prison. The notes of the Immigration Department recorded, within 3 weeks after his arrival, recorded that he had been tortured in Abu Ghraib prison and that the form of torture that most terrified him was being locked in a small cell, because in Abu Ghraib prison he'd been locked in a small cell and electrocuted randomly through water in the floor. After about 15 or 18 months, characteristically, he fell into hopelessness and despair. And there is plenty of experience in Australian detention centres to show that it takes about 15 or 18 months to break people until they fall into hopelessness and despair. And when he did, he started self-harming. And his form of self-harm was cutting himself. If he could find a piece of glass, he would break it and cut himself. If he found a piece of razor wire, he would cut himself. And whenever he did this, the Immigration Department would treat him with two forms of treatment. First, Panadol, which is the universal cure in immigration detention. I would love to have shares in Panadol. And the second was solitary confinement in a small cell. It didn't help. He would come out worse than when he went in. He'd cut himself again. More Panadol, more solitary confinement. And this went on for 5 years. Some lawyers in South Australia took an application to the federal court asking for nothing more adventurous than an order that this man and some others be admitted to the Glenside Psychiatric Hospital in Adelaide for assessment and, if necessary, for treatment. The government, of course, resisted that. That would be far too decent. And so they resisted it, and after a couple of weeks of argument, the judge eventually ordered that this man and some of the others should be admitted to Glenside for assessment and, if necessary, for treatment. On psychiatric assessment, on admission to Glenside, the psychiatrist who examined him said that he was so unwell at age 30 that he would probably never be able to hold down a job. And physically, on the physical examination, they found he had 10 metres of scarring on his body from his repeated self-harming. This was a man who they said needed nothing better than Panadol and solitary confinement. And then the case which I'm sure that some of you are aware of, the case which got me involved and locked in on this issue, was a case of an Iranian family, mum and dad and two daughters aged at the relevant time 11 and 7. They had arrived in Australia having fled Iran in desperate circumstances. They're members of a religious minority, a pre-Christian minority, a religious group who are regarded by the majority as unclean. And that group suffer the consequences that are familiar, if you know your history, of being a religious group that's regarded as unclean by the majority. Anyway, they fled to Australia, they were locked up, they were in Woomera Detention Centre, and after about 15 months, they were all in a very bad way, but especially the 11-year-old. The 11-year-old had stopped eating, she had stopped caring for herself, she'd stopped grooming herself, she wouldn't brush her hair, she wouldn't brush her teeth. She was frightened to go to the toilet block, which was hundreds of metres from their cabin, and she would wet herself during the day and wet the bed at night. And word of this got back to a psychiatrist in Adelaide, who was very concerned about it. In Woomera back then, if you had really serious need for psychiatric help, you would see the visiting psychiatrist on average once every 6 or 7 months. But this child was in a very bad way. A psychiatrist came from Adelaide to Woomera. He interviewed the child, he interviewed the family. He delivered the most devastating psych report I've ever read in any context. He said that she was at extreme risk and that it was essential that she and the family be moved to a metropolitan detention centre where she could get daily psychiatric help. Eventually, the government relented and moved the family from Woomera in the South Australian desert to Maribyrnong in the western suburbs here. And although the reason for moving them was that Martab needed daily psychiatric help, for the first 2.5 weeks of their stay in Maribyrnong, nobody came to see her. Not a psychiatrist, not a psychologist, not a nurse or a social worker, no one at all. It was as if they hadn't arrived. And on a Sunday night in May of 2002, while her mother and father and her young sister were off having their evening meal, Martab, alone in their cell in Maribyrnong, took a bedsheet and hanged herself. But she was only little and she didn't know how to tie the knot effectively, so she was still suffocating when the family came back to the room. She was taken down, she and her mother were taken to the general hospital nearby, they're placed in intensive care. They were accompanied by 2 ACM guards, so that as a matter of legal analysis, they were still in immigration detention. Con from the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre, which had only been operating about 6 or 12 months at that point, Con had been looking after their visa application. He heard about it. He went to the hospital about 9 o'clock that night. He said good day to the guards and said he just wanted to speak to the mother to see if there was anything he could do to help. And the guard said, "You're not allowed to see them because lawyers' visiting hours in immigration detention are 9 to 5. And they sent him away. He then rang me at home that night, and I'll never forget that phone call. It is monstrous to think that a country like Australia could mistreat a child so badly as to drive her to try and kill herself and then turn someone away who was just offering basic, simple human help. And I have to say, that night, that phone call locked me onto this issue so that I will never, whatever they say, I will never give up on it until they start behaving properly and get this country back to being the way it is. I should add, that child spent 12 months in the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Unit at the Austin Hospital until she was well enough to be put back in detention. And then she was sent back to the detention centre. They later gained refugee status after, I think, about 4 years in detention, and they moved to Sydney, where there's another group of their co-religionists. And I heard just the other day that that little girl, about just a month or two ago, got married, having come dux of her school in Sydney. So, I guess the low point in recent years, it's hard to find a low point when you've sunk so low, but Probably the low point in the last few years, the one which might leave you with a sense that we are beyond repair, was the election in September 2013. That election disfigured this country. It is, I think, the only election in our political history at which both major parties have tried to outbid each other on the cruelty with which they would treat a particular group of human beings. I venture to say if they'd been promising cruelty to animals, it would not have worked for them. But the atmosphere has become so poisonous in this country about boat people that promising cruelty to them seemed to be a successful political strategy. And the irony of that is, of course, they justify it by expressing a concern, I would say a false concern, about the proposition that people drown in their attempts to reach safety. I have difficulty with the logic that as an expression of your concern about people drowning, you punish those who don't drown. But that is precisely what we have been doing, and that's apparently our reason for it. The treatment they receive is, if they manage to get to Australia, the treatment they receive is quite shocking. And of course they arrive typically at Christmas Island. Of course they're not arriving anymore. We know they're setting out. We haven't stopped the boats in the sense of stopping the boats from setting out so that people are at risk of drowning. We've stopped them arriving. We don't know what happens to them when they're turned around by our Navy, because that's an operational matter and we're not allowed to know about it. How many people have drowned is something we don't know. But just before I came in here tonight, Chris Quinn gave me a document which was written on today, actually, or at least received by him today, by someone who has been on Christmas Island very, very recently, and I know Bridget Arthur has been on Christmas Island very recently too. But this tells you a little bit about the mentality of what is happening. I'll just read a couple of paragraphs from it. This is recent, right? This is just this last few days. The detainees told me they were woken in the middle of the night in their previous immigration detention centre by a group of men, Border Force officers, who were geared up for violence. They're taken from their beds in underpants, pyjamas. One man said he made the entire trip in one shoe. They're handled with extreme force, and any resistance is met with violence and verbal abuse. One very small and young detainee was shoved to the floor and his head was hit. He still had the scar on the side of his face. They're put on a plane and arrive at various airports where they are held until transported to Christmas Island. One detainee was handcuffed for 12 hours straight and still has a problem with his wrist as a consequence. When they arrive on Christmas Island, they find many of their belongings missing: personal photos and mementos, watches, rings, clothes and shoes. I noticed every single man I saw shook excessively. Only one of the men I saw was not on medication. They're not diagnosed by a psychiatrist, yet a majority of them are on antidepressants and sleeping tablets. I would find in the morning that they were groggy and slow in their cognition, and their thinking improved as the day proceeded. Every detainee I saw is profoundly depressed and suicidal. Of the 7 men I saw, 5 are self-harming on a regular basis. They said the place is awash in blood from bashing and constant self-harming. A man with obvious health issues, mental health issues, from Iraq, who arrived on Christmas Island on a boat 2.5 years ago and has never left, explained to me in great detail his plans to slit his own throat, and he would kill himself any way he could find. He said repeated requests to be transferred anywhere, even Nauru or Manus, are ignored and not even responded to. I begged him to give me some time to see what I could do to help him. I even told him I'm suffering from cancer and I don't have the choice he does. I told him his life was valuable and please not to kill himself. He was incredibly gracious and took my hand and said how incredibly sorry he was that I had cancer. He said, "You deserve life, but I'm sorry, I can't live mine like this anymore." On that visit, which was my last, I was escorted out by the Director of Operations. He questioned me about what this man had said, specifically his threat to cut his own throat. I told him that yes, he had said this, and I'm very concerned for his well-being. He raised his eyes and told me it's very unfortunate he did this, as he was doing so well. I said the man is mentally unwell and in need of help, and he proceeded to tell me he was attention-seeking and would be reprimanded for this behaviour. I was incredulous and asked if he was serious. He said, absolutely, he'll be reprimanded. Every detainee I saw was broken, cried, beyond despair. They just looked to be completely deadened. One said to me, it doesn't matter what happens, I'm already dead. That is what we are doing to people who've done nothing worse than come asking for our help. I suspect that this does not reflect the true sentiment of this country. At least I need to hope that it doesn't reflect the true sentiment of this country. I received an email from a health worker on Manus just a few days ago. Talking about Manus, the situation, as you can imagine, is very grim. Around 80% of transferees suffer serious mental health issues. PNG staff are slowly being trained, in quotes, to take over various roles with mostly undesirable results. East Lorengau, which is the place where they're placed if they are assessed as a refugee, and about 80% of them are assessed as refugees. East Lorengau is not working. One refugee is lingering in hospital for over 2 weeks with undiagnosed stomach problems. One refugee doctor is suffering severe mental health issues. And then here's a statement from a doctor. I met this doctor and had a meeting with him in my chambers, and included in the meeting was a senior Labor parliamentarian who I've known for a number of years. This doctor said this about his 1 year on Manus. And I should explain, this guy's not a bleeding heart like me. This guy has spent his professional career working in the prison system. And I suspect that he probably did not share any of my sentiments until he decided to take a 12-month stint on Manus because the pay was good. He said, on the whole, the conditions of detention at Manus are extremely poor. When I first arrived, I was considerably distressed at what I saw, and I recall thinking it must be similar to a concentration camp. The detainees at the Manus Detention Centre are detained behind razor wire fences in conditions below the standard of Australian maximum security prisons. My professional opinion is that the minimum medical requirements of the detained population were not being met. I have no reason to believe that the conditions of detention have improved since I ceased employment at Manus. The conditions of detention at Manus appeared to be calculated to break the spirit of those detained in the Manus Island Detention Centre. On a number of occasions, the extreme conditions of detention resulted in detainees abandoning their claims for asylum and returning to their country of origin. No soap is provided to detainees for personal hygiene. When detainees need to use the bathroom, it is standard procedure that they first attend at the guard station to request toilet paper. Detainees will be required to give an indication of how many squares they will need. The maximum allowed is 6 squares of toilet paper. A large number of detainees continue to be in urgent need of medical attention. Formal requests for medical attention are available to the detainees. The forms are only available in English. Many of the detainees do not have a workable understanding of English, and the guards will not help them. The senior Labor politician who attended the same meeting and heard that material from the doctor personally said to me later that he was shocked to hear that things were as bad as that in Manus. But then he said, of course, it would be political suicide for us to take a soft line on boats. And there is the problem at the political level in this polity. We have politicians on both sides, in both major parties, who are convinced that for their own political survival, they have to maintain the lie about illegals and border protection, and it would be political suicide to act in a way which is decent and which I think still characterises the sentiment of this country. Of course, we've been criticised internationally for what we are doing to people in Nauru and Manus. And just a day or two ago, you'll recall that the Special Rapporteur, Francois Crépol, was due to come and investigate conditions in Nauru and Manus by discussing circumstances with staff there. But he learned that they face 2 years jail if they tell him what they have experienced in detention. The Australian Border Force Act, which was passed earlier this year, makes it a criminal offence to tell anyone any facts that you have learned as a consequence of working in a detention centre. In ordinary civil society in Australia, if you become aware of circumstances of a child being sexually abused, it's a criminal offence not to report it. But in the detention system, it's a criminal offence to report it. That is probably the most striking illustration of how far the politics in this country have sunk. I should say, just in case there's anyone here who is a health worker in the detention system or who knows one, I have publicly already, and I repeat now, I've made the offer that if anyone speaks out on these issues and gets prosecuted, which is highly unlikely, I will put together the best pro bono defence team ever seen in this country. And I'm pretty confident that we'll have lawyers falling over themselves to be part of a team, because it's not going to happen. Because, of course, if a health worker, for example, was prosecuted for explaining in public what is going on in the detention system, then central to their defence would be the very facts that the government is trying to hide from all of us. Trying to hide those facts from all of us because, in my opinion, most Australians would be truly shocked if they knew what we were doing. If they understood how we are mistreating human beings, I think most Australians would be shocked. But who knows? I suspect that if there is such a thing as a true Liberal left in this country, they would be horrified knowing what we are doing as a matter of government policy and at vast expense. I don't know how many of you know how much it costs us to mistreat people like this. Of course, offshore detention is the most expensive way of detaining people. Onshore detention is far more expensive than allowing them to live in the community. But offshore detention, so far as we can work it out, because the components are hidden everywhere, the whole detention system is costing the country around about $5 billion a year, give or take. Now, $5 billion is a very big number, and it doesn't mean much to anyone except Gina Rinehart. But I've worked out a new unit of measure. It's 1 million Geelong chopper rides a year. Now, that really is a lot. The reason that this is happening is because the whole political stage has moved so far to the right, and both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party are locked in on the rhetoric of illegals, so that for neither of them does it seem possible to turn back to the truth, so that decency of treatment might become politically possible. And I'm not sure how far down this slippery path we need to go before it will be possible for some party to break ranks and say, look, sorry, it's all wrong, they're not illegal, they're not criminals, we don't need to be protected from them, we can actually treat them decently. But I suspect that one of the reasons that the Australian Border Force legislation was passed with its draconian provisions for secrecy, one of the reasons, I suspect, is because our politicians still understand, somewhere deep in their marrow, that Australians would not tolerate what is going on if they knew it. And the fact that they're hiding it from us is perhaps the most eloquent reflection of what they see as the basic decency of this country. I keep on saying this is a good country, you know. I have to believe that, otherwise I'd have to leave. And I think I'd rather stay. But we know a little bit more about decent behaviour than our politicians give us credit for. And there were two events in very recent days that I thought told that quite eloquently. One was our response to Syrian refugees. Now, you know, Abbott was up there saying, remember Abbott? Okay. I know, he's hard to forget, and I've tried. Abbott initially said that Australia is the most generous country in the world when it comes to resettling refugees. Well, that's a lie. We have a quota, an annual quota of 13,750. Germany just recently agreed to take 800,000 Syrian refugees. Their population is roughly 3 times our population. So if we were going to be outdoing them in generosity, we would have to take something like 300,000 Syrian refugees, and I don't see that happening. The initial reaction of Abbott was that we might take a couple of thousand refugees, but they would be squeezed into the 13,750 annual quota of voluntary resettlement. That did not seem to go down very well with the public. And it didn't take long before he said we would take 12,000 Syrian refugees on top of the quota. An enormous jump, and a jump which I think can only be explained by them reading the public sentiment about the unprecedented crisis which is forcing millions, literally millions of refugees to flee Syria. He overlooked altogether, in his boasting about our generosity, he overlooked altogether that there are, 2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey at the moment, several millions in Lebanon and in Jordan. And of course, he used to fall back on the line, well, we can't take all of them. Well, that's true, but they're not all trying to come here. And maybe they're smarter than we give them credit for. But the other thing that happened, which I thought was terrific, was on the 28th of August, you may recall that the Border Force were going to carry out an extraordinary little episode. They were going to have Mikey officials, who are my sort of favourite recent enemy, and police and Border Force people. So the way it was going to work, obviously, they didn't say this, but obviously, the Mikey people have got power to ask you for your ticket and for your ID. The police can then force you to produce your ID, and the Border Force people could then say, show us your visa status, because the person doesn't have any local ID. And I think news of that got out late morning on the 28th of August. And Melbourne turned out in force to protest at such a grotesque idea. And by mid-afternoon, they'd called it off. Now, I thought Melbourne deserved the biggest pat on the back for showing there is a line we will not cross, and that's where the line is. And I thought it was just fantastic. At heart, I believe, and I want to believe, but I genuinely believe that at heart, this is still the country that David Hamer and Dick Hamer served with such distinction. And I just wish that someone would tell our current politicians that fact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Julian, for what was a pretty scary presentation, actually, a pretty thought-provoking presentation, and I'm glad you ended on an upbeat answer to your own question, what sort of country we have, because we might all have gone away feeling terribly, terribly depressed about this, the best country in the world, we're continually told. I see you studiously refrain from talking about where this policy might be going now that we have a new Prime Minister. I know we don't have a new Immigration Minister, and I'm not quite sure what to read into that, but maybe some of our questioners will want to ask you about where you think we're going from here, or at least what advice you'd like to give to the new Prime Minister as he starts to think about where we should be going from here. But I want to now open the floor to questions. We have about 10 minutes, and I'll take as many as we can in that time. Up here at the back.
Thank you very much. I recently saw a preview of a film called Simshar, and it is really fabulous. I would recommend it to anyone as a way of maybe sneaking in under the radar and inviting the people who won't have the conversation with you just to a night at the movies to see how they feel after they see this. But maybe Julian's seen it and can add to my commentary and my recommendation.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning Simshark. Kate and I saw it last week, and I think it's a brilliant film, marvellously shot, terrifically well told, and no matter what you think about refugees and boat people, it's a film worth seeing, definitely worth seeing. It's going to be on cinema release, I think, starting on the 1st of October for a couple of weeks. And it'll be at the Lido in Hawthorne, at the Nova in Carlton, and I think at another cinema which I can't remember. Anyway, look for it. Simshark. It's very good.
Thank you. Yes.
Julian, in March, you're interviewed by Lawyers Weekly in relation to the possibility of Jeffrey Robertson and I think another prominent lawyer being engaged to prosecute members of this government and previous government by the ICC. Can you tell me, have there been any developments in that regard?
Yeah, look, I don't think getting the ICC to prosecute our politicians is very realistic because they've got bigger fish to fry, to be quite candid. They've got mass murderers to deal with and they're under-resourced as it is. I am in the final stages of completing a communique to the ICC inviting them to investigate the behaviour of our politicians in relation to boat people in the hope that an investigation might send the right message through the public. I know Jeff Robertson. I would probably not choose. I have actually lined up another English barrister to make the running on it because I want it to look as though it's entirely outside Australia. That's part of the point. And Jeff would be seen as being, one of the usual suspects, I think.
Thank you. Over here.
Thank you. That was very interesting. But now the question is, what can we do?
I can't tell you how many times I've been asked that. And, every idea I've had so far has failed, so this answer is probably worthless. I still think it is worthwhile contacting your local federal member and the member of the opposite party to express your concern about it. I gather that parliamentarians are troubled if they get personal communication from their constituents. And if enough people start doing it, then maybe they'll get the message. Beyond that, depending on your circumstances, volunteering at some of the places that offer support services for refugees is a great thing to do. The Asylum Seekers Resource Centre is an obvious one, the Refugee and Immigration Legal Centre. There are various local groups that have set up to support refugees. If ever you get the opportunity to make a refugee feel welcome in the community, do it. Oh, here's the thing, the idea of welcome meals at the local town hall I think is really worth pursuing. The idea in broad is the local town hall arranges a very simple dinner, a meal at which there'll be equal numbers of long-time residents and recently arrived people who've come as refugees, and have them sit round a table and have a meal together. It's hard to maintain prejudiced hatred of someone else when you've shared a meal with them. And if we did that right across the country, that might change enough attitudes that we could get somewhere.
Thank you.
That's as many as I can think of at the moment.
Yes, thank you. You've answered one question I've already had. What motivates you? That's great. How quickly will the federal government learn about the content of your lecture tonight and what might they do? Who are today's Dick and David Hamers? And will there be a Kennett oration, except if Hawthorn win the AFL Grand Final?
I think one of the basic structural problems in politics in Australia today is we do not have any leaders left. There are no political leaders anywhere in politics that I can see. I mean, remember the public reaction when Malcolm Fraser died in March this year and Gough Whitlam died in November last year. No matter what part of politics people were from, they recognised that two giants of our political system had gone. Where do you find the giants these days? you look in vain. To be honest, the only politician who really impresses me at the moment, no, two who really impress me. One is Melissa Park, who has the seat of Fremantle that Carmen Lawrence had, and the other is Richard Di Natale, who I think is very impressive. I'm not sure I'd rank them as giants in the same sense as Fraser and Whitlam. And by the way, if we're talking giants, I'd also include Robert Menzies, and before that perhaps Curtin, although I had no experience of him. There's not a party political thing, you understand. It's about the capacity for leadership, which is really the capacity to stand up and say, this is what I believe, this is why I believe it, and we are therefore going to do this or that. You know, what we've got now is a bunch of people who have fallen into the Jim Hacker school of leadership. Remember Jim Hacker, yes, Prime Minister, he said, I'm their leader, I must follow them. Well, we're being run by you know, news polls. It's hopeless.
There's a question at the back there.
Hi, thanks for a very engaging talk. Just had a question about the recently publicised campaign between the new No Business and Abuse and Get Up. Do you think this type of corporate efforts are valid, I guess? And my other question is, in light of the content that you've sort of dealt with today, do you think that undermining a management system of an inherently flawed management of our refugee intake, do you think that's sort of an appropriate methodology to challenge the way we deal with this?
Yes.
Good.
And in fact, there's another idea for the lady over here who asked what to do. If you've got any shares in Transfield, dump them. If you've got any shares in their major financiers, dump them and tell them why.
You've changed their name.
The point is, I don't think you have to make such substantial inroads into people's commercial interests before you'll have an effect. In retail politics, you've got to get 50% plus one. In commerce, where people are much more astute, 30%, I understand, will be enough. If 30% of the population get onto a divestment campaign, that will bite. So that'd be a great thing to do.
I think we've got time for perhaps two more questions, or maybe three. I see three hands, and that's it. There's one hand there, one hand there, and one hand right at the back there.
Thank you. When the new Prime Minister was interviewed by Lee Sales a week or so ago, he used the phrase emotional intelligence, I think, twice, and empathy in that conversation. Do you think that's just a cynical ploy by the PR people to provide a point of difference even if nothing else changes, or do you see that as an encouraging sign that at least that language is starting to be introduced into the political conversation in a way that it hasn't been for at least the last 2 years?
I don't know. It's just a bit too early to tell. I have actually met Malcolm Turnbull a few times through some common friends, and I found him very engaging, very intelligent, and very interesting. I only met John Howard once or twice, and he would not say a single word to me. And I never met Tony Abbott because I don't surf. But the anxiety I have with Malcolm Turnbull is that he may be less attractive than he seems. More than most people in this community, he understands the shortcomings of an NBN with fibre to the node, and yet he embraced it for political reasons. If he's as flexible as that with policies about human rights, well then all his fine talk about empathy and emotional intelligence may not count for anything at all. And he's got 44 people in the party room who wish he wasn't there, and that's a problem.
So there was somebody right at the back.
Thank you very much, Julian. I'd like to see what you think of this suggestion, which is that rather than people writing to their local MP, and I have to say I write to Josh Frydenberg and I don't get a response, so, I kind of given up on that. What we should all be doing is writing directly to Malcolm Turnbull and to Bill Shorten, and we should tell them the same thing, which is what they need to do is to get together and have the courage to come out together and say, we got this wrong. We are bringing these people back to Australia from Nauru and Manus. We are never going to allow any more boat people to land in Australia, but we have got to stop dealing with these people in that fashion. And if they both said, we got this wrong, and I don't actually think the Greens would object to that. I know that Ricky Muir would be on side with that. Surely, couldn't they get away with that?
Look, that might work. The approach to writing to parliamentarians that I prefer is not one which persuades them that you're right and they're wrong, because that's generally a losing strategy, but rather one which might make them inquire into the facts. And if you go to my website, there's somewhere there's a thing about writing to parliamentarians, and the essential point is you ask them one or two short questions, and that's it. And if they don't answer, you write to them again. So, character, the ideal would be, Dear X, I'm a voter in your electorate. Do you think boat people are illegal, quote unquote? If yes, what offence do they commit? Yours faithfully. And if they don't answer, Dear so-and-so, I'm still a voter in your electorate. I wrote to you, I haven't heard from you. Do you think boat people are illegal? If so, what offence do they commit? Yours faithfully. And repeat as necessary. If you get back 2 pages written by a staffer, which is the most likely thing on your 3rd or 4th attempt, then you write back and say, I received your response, it didn't answer my questions, here they are again, yours faithfully.
Sorry, Julian, so you don't see the point in writing to the leaders?
Suggested as possibilities.
Yeah. So you don't see the point in writing to the leaders of the parties?
I have seen replies received by people who wrote to Shorten, and the answers, he flicked it on to someone else, and the answer was just a press release. So maybe doing it repeatedly is useful. At least you'll have a record of how many times they're prepared to ignore you. And that's in itself useful. So yeah, give it a bell. Like, I mean, as I say, all of my ideas have failed, so yours might work, who knows?
I'm afraid we're about to run out of time. We had one last question and I've lost the hand.
There's a hand over there.
All right, there's a hand over there. We'll take that hand.
I would like to ask about the role of international law. Can the international law intervene in those kind of policies, even though we have a case of sovereignty here, of domestic sovereignty? Can the international law actually answer and respond adequately in such cases, because we are talking about treatment of people from other countries? So can we have an adequate response?
Short answer is no, international law doesn't really help, largely because our international human rights conventions that we've signed are not incorporated into domestic law. Second reason is because, as Tony Abbott reminded us, we're sick of being lectured to by the UN. And third, if you're interested in these things, there's a very good book by Philippe Sands, who's an international lawyer based in London, called Lawless World, in which he makes the broad point, in the immediate aftermath of Guantanamo Bay, that when it comes to trade deals, international law is heavily respected and enforced, but when it comes to humanitarian law conventions, it's disregarded very substantially. So it's sad, but that's the fact. It's not really very powerful. Just a nice idea.
That's a depressing note to end on for somebody who's worked all her life in international law, Julian.
I'll think how much worse it might have been if you hadn't.
Well, I take that, yes. Look, thank you all very much for having been such a responsive audience. I would have one suggestion to add to all the suggestions Julian's made about what you can do, and I would suggest that Julian be exposed to an audience that is not of the like mind to him, rather than only of the like mind. And it's very good to hear so many people so sympathetic to the very tragic things you've been telling us and talking about. I think it would be very good to go out into the broader community and expose precisely those sorts of stories, those kind of concerns, to a much wider populace. And perhaps then we really build up that groundswell of decency that you're very sure, and I am too, resides in the public out there. But thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Julian for an excellent